Chapter 10. The Norm. Who? Quote, Klein was pondering the mysterious suicide of the original host and the possible unknown dangers he might encounter when he heard a sudden knock at the door. Instinctively, he opened the drawer, took out the revolver, and asked cautiously, "Who is it?" Quote, after a quiet 2 seconds outside, a slightly shrill voice with an Ahawa accent called out, "It's me, Beach Mountbatten." The voice paused, then added, "Police. Beach Mountbatten." As the name entered his ears, Klein immediately thought of its owner. He was one of the police officers in charge of the apartment block. A rough and tough man who loved to use his hands. Perhaps only such a person could intimidate the drunks, thieves, part-time thieves, villains, and hooligans in the area. And his distinctive voice was one of his trademarks. "All right, I'll be right there," Klein responded loudly. He had intended to throw the revolver back into the drawer, but considering that the police outside might be here for a search or something, he cautiously ran to the stove, which had long since gone out, and placed the gun inside. Then, he picked up a small basket filled with coal, shook a few lumps into the stove to cover the gun, and finally placed a kettle on top to hide everything. After completing these preparations, he straightened his clothes, quickly approached the door, and opened it while mumbling, "Sorry, I was just napping." Standing outside the door were 4 police officers in black uniforms with white checks and wearing badge caps. Among them Beach Mountbatten, who coughed once and said to Klein, "These 3 officers have some questions for you." "Officers?" Klein reflexively looked at the epaulets of the other 3, noticing that 2 of them had 3 silver hexagonal stars, and 1 had 2, appearing to be of higher rank than Beach Mountbatten, who had only 3 V-shaped tags. As a history student, Klein didn't know much about police epaulette ranks, only aware that Beach Mountbatten often boasted about being a senior sergeant. So, were these 3 inspectors? Influenced by conversations with his older brother Benson and his classmates like Welch, Klein knew a bit of common sense, stepped aside, and pointed inside the room. "Please come in. May I know what this is about?" Quote, the leader among the 3 officers, a middle-aged man with a gaze so piercing it seemed to see through souls, causing an instinctive fear, had noticeable wrinkles around his eyes and light brown hair peeking from under his hat. He looked around the room while asking in a stern voice, "Do you know Welch Magwin?" Quote, "What happened to him?" Klein's heart trembled as he blurted out, "I'm asking you," said the stern middle-aged officer, his gaze intimidating. The officer next to him with the 3-star epaulets smiled gently and said, "Don't be nervous. It's just a routine inquiry." This officer, about 30, had a prominent nose and gray eyes that gave a deep, indescribable feeling, like a secluded lake in an ancient forest. Klein took a deep breath and organized his words. "If you're referring to the graduate from Hoy University, Welch Magwin from Conston, then yes, I know him. We were classmates and studied under the same mentor, Senior Associate Professor Quentin Cohen. In the Kingdom of Ruin, professor was not just a title but also a position, similar to a combination of professor and department head on Earth, meaning that a department at a university could only have 1 professor. Associate professors could only become full professors by waiting for their superior to retire or by outcompeting them, given the need to retain talent. After years of exploration, the Kingdom's Higher Education Committee had added the rank of Senior Associate Professor to the Lecturer, Associate Professor, and Professor system, to accommodate those with high academic levels or sufficient seniority who yet couldn't become professors. Continuing, Klein glanced into the middle-aged officer's eyes and hesitated for a second before saying, "To be honest, our relationship is quite good. Recently, Naya, and I often met to interpret and discuss the quaternary documents he obtained. A notebook. Officer. What happened to him? Quote, the middle-aged officer didn't answer but looked sideways at his gray-eyed companion. The badge-capped, ordinary-looking officer with gray eyes replied calmly, I'm sorry to inform you. Mr. Welch has passed away. How could this be? Despite a premonition, Klein couldn't help but exclaim in shock. Had Welch died just like the original owner of the body? This was somewhat terrifying. And Naya? Klein hurriedly asked. Ms. Naya has also passed away, said the officer with gray eyes. Quite calmly. They both died at Mr. Welch's residence. Were they killed? Klein vaguely guessed. Perhaps it was a suicide. The officer with gray eyes shook his head. No. From the evidence at the scene, it appears they committed suicide. Mr. Welch repeatedly banged his head against the wall, so many times that the wall was covered in blood, and Ms. Naya drowned herself in a basin, the kind used for washing faces. This can't be. Klein listened, his hair standing on end, as he could almost imagine that eerie scene. The girl kneeling on a chair, her face buried in a basin full of water, her brown hair flowing down, swaying with the breeze, her body motionless. Welch lying on the ground, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his forehead completely shattered, covered in blood, with impact marks on the wall, blood everywhere. The officer with gray eyes slightly moved his lips and said, We think so too. But the autopsy results and the scene evidence exclude factors like drugs and external forces. There are no signs of resistance from either Mr. Welch or Ms. Naya. Before Klein could speak again, the officer stepped into the room and casually asked, When was the last time you saw Mr. Welch or Ms. Naya? Quote, as he spoke, he subtly gestured to his companion with 2 silver stars. This was a young officer, about the same age as Klein, with black hair and green eyes, handsome with a poetic air about him. Hearing the question, Klein quickly thought and responded, It must have been June 26th. We were together interpreting a new piece of the notebook. And after that, I went home to prepare for an interview on the 30th, for the history department at Tingen University. Tingen, known as the City of Universities, hosts not only Tingen and Hoi universities but also a technical school, a law college, and a business school, second only to the capital, Beckland. As soon as he finished speaking, Klein saw from the corner of his eye the young officer approaching the desk and picking up the notebook, which looked more like a diary. Oh no, I forgot to hide it, Klein exclaimed abruptly. You, quote. The young officer smiled at him but didn't stop flipping through the notebook. While the officer with gray eyes explained, This is a necessary procedure. At this time, Beach Mountbatten and the stern middle-aged officer were just watching, not intervening or assisting in the search. Shouldn't you have a search warrant? Klein was about to challenge this. But after thinking it through, he realized that the legal system of the Kingdom of Ruin might not have evolved to include search warrants. At least he wasn't aware of any, considering the police force itself was only established 15 or 16 years ago. In the original owner's childhood, it was still called a sheriff's office. Klein couldn't stop them, watching helplessly as the young officer quickly went through his notebook, and the officer with gray eyes asked no further questions. Anything strange? The young officer suddenly asked after flipping to the end. And what does this sentence mean? Everyone will die, including me. Isn't it common knowledge that everyone dies except for the gods? Klein was ready to quibble. But then he suddenly remembered that he had intended to connect with the police to guard against potential dangers, though he had no reason or excuse to do so. Within less than a second, he made a decision, covered his forehead with his hand, and replied with pain in his voice. I don't know. I really don't know. I woke up this morning feeling a bit off. As if I've forgotten some things. Especially recent events. And I don't even know why I would write such a sentence. Sometimes, honesty is the best way to solve problems. Of course, being honest requires tact. What can be said and what cannot is one aspect. And in what order to say things is another. As a keyboard expert, Klein had studied a bit of rhetoric. Ridiculous. Do you think we're fools? Beach Mountbatten angrily interjected, unable to hold back anymore. Such a clumsy lie was an insult to their intelligence. Pretending to be mentally ill would be better than pretending to have amnesia. Really? Klein calmly met the eyes of Mountbatten and the middle-aged officer. This matter couldn't be truer. Maybe it is possible. At that moment, the officer with gray eyes slowly spoke. What? You believe that? Klein himself was surprised. The officer with gray eyes smiled at him and said, in a couple of days, an expert will come. Trust me. She should be able to help you recall the memories you've lost. An expert? To help with memories? In psychology? Klein frowned. What if it brings up memories from my time on Earth? He suddenly felt a toothache. The young officer put down the notebook and searched the desk and room again. Fortunately focusing on the books and not lifting the kettle to look. All right, Mr. Klein. Thank you for your cooperation. In the coming days, you'd best not leave Tingen. If you must, please inform Officer Mountbatten. Otherwise, you will become a fugitive, the officer with gray eyes finally cautioned. Is this it? Is it over for today? No more questions. No more investigations? Or taking me back to the station for interrogation? Klein was bewildered. However, he also wanted to resolve the eerie incidents brought about by Welch. So he nodded. No problem. The officers left the room one by one. And the young man at the end suddenly patted Klein's shoulder. That's good. Very lucky. What? Klein was confused. The young officer with the poetic air and green eyes slightly smiled and said, normally, in such cases, everyone involved ends up dead. We're very glad, and quite fortunate, to see you're still alive. After saying this, he walked out of the room, closing the door politely behind him. Everyone involved ends up dead? Glad I'm still alive? Fortunate I'm still alive? On this afternoon in June, Klein felt a chill run through his body.